Hello to all of you. I'd also like to acknowledge the Eora people, the land we're on, and the elders of those people who may be present. I'd also like to acknowledge the Art Gallery of New South Wales for their incredible generosity in getting me here and looking after me so comfortably. Both Ashley and Shona have been terrific to work with, and I appreciate it because it's not always so. I'd also like to acknowledge the NAIDOC week, which is a wonderful week for all Australians, but particularly so for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, because it's a week of celebration. I'd like to tell you a few yarns because that's all I am. I'm a storyteller. The first series of yarns are about 4 men and 1 woman, but in the time I'm talking about in Victoria and elsewhere, there weren't terribly many white women around, and Aboriginal women were never asked anything. Mr. Kirby was walking along the Murray River in 1839, and he came across a fisherman who was sitting on a weir that he'd constructed into the river and had made it in such a fashion that all the water was channeled through the weir, and any fish that wanted to move up the river had to do so through a small net that had been placed in the river. Mr. Kirby sat down under a tree and watched this operation for some time and noticed that there was a stick arrangement anchored into the ground, very fine, narrow stick with and being tied down, so it had a lot of tension on the string, and the tie disappeared into the water. And he wasn't sure what was going on, whether it was a fishing rod or what the arrangement was, but then he noticed that a fish, the stick released and a fish flung over the fisherman's shoulder and landed behind him. And Mr. Kirby noticed that the man was aware that he was being observed and casually reached behind him, picked up the fish and tossed it into a basket, and then leant back on his elbow and waited. This went on, Mr. Kirby's observation, for an hour or more, and every few minutes another fish would be flung back over the fisherman's shoulder, and he would, with great insouciance, toss it into the basket. Aboriginal people sometimes get a bit nervous when other Aboriginal people use big words, but I'm a bookish sort of a person, and I grew up with words and I love them, and Aboriginal people traditionally spoke 7 or 8 languages. We were the great wordsmiths of the world, and one day we'll recover that pride in the words. So I'm happy to use insouciance because that's exactly what Mr. Kirby observed. This man, aware of being observed, was proud of his achievement and a bit disdainful of this other man watching him. He didn't even speak to the man, but he did observe how the tie from the springy stick was tied onto a noose. Every time a fish swam through the noose, it triggered the peg that was holding the noose down, and it flung the fish out of the water. This was engineering, and the man was very proud of his achievement. A man called Mitchell on the Narran River on the Queensland-New South Wales border, round about the same time, rode through grasslands up to the withers of his horse rode through those grasslands for 9 miles. And throughout the 9 miles, grass was stooked like the old English stooks. It was set in piles, and he rode through this for 9 miles. Leichhardt was another man who visited that country and disappeared. Another man called Gregory came and followed in Leichhardt's footsteps and hoof prints, and they camped because they were tired and felt they were lost, and they saw Aboriginal people on these grasslands, and they witnessed them for 3 days while they repaired their carts, while they fixed up their horses' saddlery, while they recovered their spirits and their health. For 3 or 4 days, Gregory's people witnessed people harvesting grain. Then he saw a phenomenal thing. He saw people sowing grain, and the next day saw people irrigating that grain. Later on, the harvested grain from the last season was sorted into stores, and some of it was put in pouches and worn around the neck, and was destined to be traded to neighbouring peoples. This was a trade in grain. Mr. Smith, from the Northern Territories, part Aboriginal man, came across a number of people building what looked to him like a dam. He watched very carefully and very circumspectly, because these weren't his people, and he stood back a mile off from this project and just watched. Eventually the old men motioned him into the camp, and he asked them about what they were doing, and he said, "Oh, you know, we're going to do another one tomorrow. You can watch that too if you like." And the next day another dam was built, and that dam had an exit from it into some channels which ran through flat ground, and those people were irrigating a crop. Ernest Giles' brother, a bit earlier than this, was travelling through the Northern Territory and came across huge stores of what he discovered was grain, stored up in platforms 3 metres off the ground. Each of those stores weighed a tonne. He'd never seen anything like it before, but it didn't stop him stealing it, because once again, he was an explorer, he was lost, and he was hungry. So he took the grain that had been stored for the harvesters. There was a woman of Cape Otway, and it was me who discovered her secrets. Because near my home, near the Cape Otway Lighthouse at that time, I came across a midden that had been exposed by a great storm. Cape Otway is pretty good at having great storms, and the face of the midden had sheared away and exposed a whole lot of tools. And there were the normal tools that you would find: axes, scythes, hammers, augers, bone spear points for sewing clothes. But there was one little stone about that big, like the size of the top of a matchbox, and I couldn't work it out. It had various holes drilled in it of different dimensions, had notches on the side, and it had straight lines. And I couldn't work out what this was, and I worried about it for days and days and days, and eventually my mother came down. She was living out of Polar Bay, not far away. My mother is blind, deaf and epileptic, but quite well. And I gave it to my mother. I said, "What do you reckon this is?" And she felt it, and she said, "Oh, this is a sewing kit." she felt the holes and she felt the lines, and she said, I used to have one like this when I was a kid, made out of tin, and it was for sharpening needle points, bone needle points, getting an edge on the fine side of the needle, and notches for cutting twine. It was a very, very intimate thing, and I was more or less ashamed to be handling it. I did so in ignorance, but it wasn't really my business. I returned all those things to the site, and they're still there. I go back every now and then and see them. Another man called Todd in 1835 was one of the very first white people to visit Victoria. He was supposed to be guarding the land for John Batman. John Batman had gone back to Tasmania because his nose was falling off. John Batman, the great discoverer of Victoria, had syphilis, and his nose was falling off. He went back to Tasmania, and there was a reason why he had syphilis, and there was a reason why a lot of Aboriginal women in Tasmania had syphilis too. Todd was told to wait there and not upset the Aboriginal people, and so Todd wasn't a bad sort of a man. You know, if he was looking after your milk bar or your pub or your hardware store, you could rely on his abilities because he just seemed like a decent sort of a bloke. And he talked to the Aboriginal people as much as he could, learnt some words, seemed to be kind, gave people the things that they seemed to be interested in, accepted what he was given in return. It was, you know, nice warm weather. Everything seemed to be going pretty well. And Todd, in his spare time, because he seemed to have a lot of it, was happy to fish with the people, but also to draw, make drawings of them as they fished or as they participated in other cultural activities. But one of these drawings is a line of women and girls bending over with sticks about that long, and it's a transformative piece of Australian art. Not very good, but it's transformative because the women were digging up a yam pasture field that, if you look at the scale, is probably 6-7 acres wide. It's a big paddock, and it's full of yam daisy, and that's what those women were doing. They were digging up the yam daisy, selecting the mature tubers and pressing them down. When they selected their tubers, they pressed down the remaining tubers to regenerate the crop. And you can see all this in Todd's drawing, and we're very, very fortunate to have it, because the next year there was no yam daisy in Victoria. Wherever a sheep had roamed, they came across the yam pastures, they gravitated to them because they were such good eating. And sheep, because of their dentition, are able to crop the basal leaves of yam daisies right down to the ground. A kangaroo can't do it, a wombat can't do it, a bandicoot can't do it, but a sheep can. They wiped out the yam daisy in one season. You hardly can find a yam daisy in Victoria now. Some people are growing them commercially. But if you go along the railway tracks around Werribee and places like that, you'll see plenty of it. So what do you call what all these people saw? What I saw, what Mr. Kirby saw, what Mr. Mitchell, what Mr. Gregory, what Mr. Smith, what Mr. Giles, what Mr. Todd, what were they looking at? I'm having a battle at the moment with senior academics in Australia, which I'm losing profoundly because I'm not an academic. I'm just a bloke who lives in the bush. But I can read, and these are the things I've read. And I'm saying to people, as I'm saying to you, I'm proselytising, I'm using you. It looks to me as if these are not the habits of hunter-gatherers. Aboriginal people are called hunter-gatherer. What's all this business of irrigating crops, harvesting crops, having granaries of over a tonne in several parcels, trading grain, cultivating yam pastures, having 3,000 kilometres of eel races around the town of Koroit in Victoria? What is going on? This isn't hunter-gathering. So I'm asking you what you think. If we can't use words like horticulturalist, because I've had the ruler over my knuckles for suggesting such a thing, we can't say tilling. I was admonished for that. We can't say apparently farming. We can't say cultivation. What is going on? I know it's not hunter-gathering. Aboriginal people in that era knew it wasn't hunter-gathering. Maybe the term hunter-gathering is just very convenient for people who wanted to take the land. Because if you're hunter-gathering, your possession of the soil is itinerant. So I'm asking you to rack your brains. Because, you're in New South Wales, and I know that you've all got good brains, and I want you to think of a word that how you would describe those activities. Because I came up here early this morning and I cased out the joint, wanted to know where I was going to work. I came in here and walked through the door, no one stopped me, kept going. They never stopped me. Walked past that desk over there, the lady smiled at me, didn't stop me. I went down and looked at the dreaming exhibition, no one stopped me. I thought, what a well-run state this New South Wales is. Free art. What a fantastic thing, what a civilised way. And I was, everyone I met seemed to be very pleasant. The city seemed to be working. I thought, geez, the government of New South Wales must be really working well. But then I'm from Victoria, so what would I know about good government? And I recommend the Dreamers to you because there's some fantastic art there. I was just down listening to Julie Goff talk about her art, and that was a fascinating yarn. But if you look at the works of Ronnie Jampan Jimma, his work I find quite mesmerising, and I reckon it's really worth a look. And the same with Judy Watson. Now, I've seen Judy Watson's work for 30-odd years, I reckon, and I've seen such a transformation in her work. You can still see some of the old ideas there, but the forms that she uses are just fantastic. And there's a little bit in the I don't know what you'd call them, whether they're cloths or whatever. She's printed on cloth. There's a little hint there of the late and great Linonis, which is a real compliment. He's a great figure. And if you're going to look at John Mulwinjul, don't let him inside your head. Have a look at that one called Yorkie York, but don't look for too long, I don't think, because I felt terribly uncomfortable looking at that painting. It put the wind right up me. And so have a look at his paintings, but don't let that man get in your head, because he's a spirit man. And there are messages there that really are quite disturbing. So So if we can't use words like agriculture to describe what Aboriginal people were doing, I think our country has caught itself in a cleft stick. Because the other thing that disappeared from the history of our country was all the observation of the early settlers, farmers, whatever you like to call them, land grabbers, entrepreneurs like Gellibrand, who everywhere that man had gone, he selected lands off Indigenous peoples. He did it in India, and I think I'm right in saying he did it in Africa, and he did it in Tasmania, then he did it in Victoria. He would buy lands and sell them within 3-4 weeks, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year. He became incredibly wealthy, and he got lost in the Victorian bush trying to find more land, and Australia is still grieving for him today. We call suburbs after that man. We call train lines, train stations after Gellibrand. We called a soft drink Gellibrand, would you believe? And, you know, I don't know why, because he wasn't a very nice man. He was a terribly cruel man. And not that he harmed Aboriginal people directly, but always indirectly. He had an incredible indirect influence because he drafted all the laws which robbed Tasmanian Aboriginal people of their lives. So the man with the pen did as much damage as the brute with the shotgun. So don't just incarcerate the brute. Always look for the man with a pen. And I got one, so you've got to watch out for me too. But in the record, the historical record, which this mug, untrained historian, found easy to find. It had to be easy, otherwise I wouldn't have found it. Like I'm uncoordinated when it comes to systems, and so I had to go into libraries, and I found, it was a struggle for me because I didn't even understand the Dewey system when I first went in, right? But I found this information really easy, and I read about a house in the Western District that was so large it had 4 centre poles. It was divided into 15 rooms and could accommodate 50 people. I'd gone through primary school, high school, university, and I'd taught history in schools, not because I was a history teacher, but because there was no one else to do it. So they said, "You'll do." So I taught history, and I'm ashamed of myself because I taught a history of enormous ignorance. When I was in the Mitchell Library, which is another free institution you can go to in this terribly well-run state of New South Wales, and I was bawling my eyes out because I was finding out, I was looking for my family, but in the process I was finding out how stupid I was. And I was finding this information so easily that it disgusted me. Because not only was I incapable of realising that the history that had been sold to me was a baby story, but I realised that most of my fellows believed the same. A man called Rupert Gerritsen has written a book about what he calls incipient agriculture in Australia. And I kind of love him. I've never met him, but I kind of love him for the effort involved because he's absolutely copped a complete caning from a lot of people, the hunter-gatherer mob of academic research. They don't like the inference that he's making because he talks about incipient agriculture. See, I'm looking for a word that doesn't use a word like incipient because it sounds like a disease, doesn't it? It's not. It's a bit edgy and, it's not quite agriculture, but we've got to find a new term. Australians, have to find new ways of talking about the past, and this is one of the things that we have to address. So Gerritsen also talks about some of these houses, and he gives good examples of them, and they're all based on white man's observation. Because at the time that people like James Dawson from the Western District were recording these things, Aboriginal people weren't asked anything. If they were convicted of a murder, they weren't asked to defend themselves because their witness, their evidence wasn't acceptable to the court. So a lot of Aboriginal people were hung without ever being asked a question. Though the question was asked of a missionary, none of whom could speak the language. So a lot of damage was done to a lot of people simply because the law at that time didn't give credence to Aboriginal observation. So Rupert Gerritsen has been quite brave, I think, in analysing some of these things and recording, assembling these descriptions of houses. Other people have done it too, but Gerritsen has done it in a book which is being published in England. Couldn't get it published in Australia. Been published in England, and it's going to be released in Australia, I hope. But I've seen the manuscript of it, and I think it's quite transformative, like some of these other things I was talking about before, because it puts a different perspective on what was happening in Australia. Vicky Cousins, who is the great-great-granddaughter of John Cousins, who went with the first Australian cricket team to England, all black, and Gunich Mara cricket team went to England to play cricket over there before the first test was played by Australian white cricketers. She's related to one of those. She has just revived with her sisters and her aunties and her grandmothers the tradition of possum skin cloak fabrication. The possum skin cloak for southern Australia was an enormous item because in the cooler regions it was a one way of occupying the country and staying alive. Pretty cold in Victoria and Tasmania, and these cloaks were to keep house and home together. And a lot of people collected these cloaks, and I've seen them on the beds of rural Victorian farmers. And one of them, you know, my heritage goes, you know, way back, you know, and you know, a lot of people would say, gee, you know, you're a lot more bloody Cornish than you are Koori, you know, which is an incredibly good observation and is quite true if we're going to talk percentages. But in the process of looking for my family, I came across this other history of the country, and so I was locked in because there's no going backwards. Once you know something, how do you forget it? So I was looking around to see what was left of the culture, and Vicky Cousins, I knew her auntie, who was a very wonderful woman and was a basket weaver, and there's a bit of weaving going on downstairs after this. And Auntie Zelda used to collect grass off my property at Cape Otway because I had this lamandra grass, and it's perfect for weaving, you know. So my claim to fame in Victoria is that I supply the grass to all the old ladies. But Vicky Cousins, in consultation with this lady and a lot of other women around Victoria, started reviving the skills of making possum skin cloaks. The great irony is they weren't allowed to kill possums because they're a protected animal. So they had to import them from New Zealand. There's a bit of a joke there, but you know, we're a bit hung up about our Australian animals. You know, if kangaroos get in plague proportions, which they do quite frequently in Victoria, no one is allowed to touch a hair on their little pouch. But really, we should probably be eating those animals, which we do, and you know, we can get it in the supermarket down in Mallacoota now, so anyone can. And every now and then one falls over in the paddock quite near my house, just falls down suddenly like that, and we eat that too, because it's a gift. It just fell over, and so we eat it. It's wonderful food. The animal has almost no impact on the ground. It does not compact it, and it's almost greenhouse free. I think Vicky Cousins has done a fantastic thing, but because while she was collecting all that information about sewing, because these cloaks were sewn around the shoulder, the women's cloak had a small pouch in the back that could be retrieved from the back, brought round to the front, and a baby could slot straight into it. My daughter's having a baby tomorrow, with any kind of luck, so this is on my mind. But this pouch could be worn in the front, or it could be slung down to the back and carried on the back beneath the cloak, and the baby could be warm and the mother could work. It was a great invention, but all this had to be sewn. And there were buttonholes and things like that, and the inside was one whole length of artwork. And if you go down to the Dreamers, you'll see a lot of those hatchings and things like that on the bark. Well, many of these possum skins were etched like that inside. They're incredible works of art. They're great cultural statements, and Australia is lucky to have them, and very, very lucky to have young women, because anyone under 55 is young to me, young women of today recovering those skills and prepared to share it with the rest of Australia. While they were doing that, of course, they had to have big camps out in the bush, all the old ladies, all the young girls, and they'd have campfires, billy tea, and a hell of a lot of giggling, and language was recovered. People would remember what they could hear their grandmothers and their mothers talking about when they were making those cloaks. So a whole system of language was recovered to go with the cloaks. And I've been involved in language recovery. I sort of fell into it. My grandmother's language would have been one of the Coucal languages, so I started to learn one, which was Wathaurong, because that was the country I was living in at the time. And I was just learning it to I was trying to recover my culture, I suppose. I didn't really know what I was doing at the time, but anyway, the lady who had been working on language recovery of the Wathaurong language went and got a better job. And so they asked me, because there was no money in it, so they asked me would I do it, and I leapt at the chance because it was like the golden key. There's a sculpture in here somewhere of a group of figures, and there's a black slave with holding out a thing like that, and it's got keys on it. And I'm not really sure what I'm looking at, but it looks to me like it's a slave market, and this black man is offering the key to his chains to a buyer. But I thought I'd got one of those keys, because when they said you can go to any library, including the Mitchell Library, which I did, and all other libraries around, they gave me that key. They said you can go there, and I found out these things which shocked and shamed me. But the other thing I found while I was researching the language was how stable the languages were, how they'd stayed in situ for thousands and thousands, 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 years. We'll find out one day. But how important is it after 40,000 years, 50,000 years? It's already 50 times greater than any civilization on Earth has lasted. How old are the pyramids? How old is papyrus? How old are the caves in France where that art is so celebrated? Hundreds of years, some of them. 2,000 years. What's the pyramids, 4,000? Any advance on 4,000? It's not much. So whatever the length occupation of Australia is, and Aboriginal people say we have been here all the time, because 40,000 years is all the time, 60,000 years is longer than all the time. These languages have been in place. The languages of the Gunditj Shmara talk about volcanicity, volcanoes, scoria, these things. They are old languages and they've stayed there. No other of the languages in Australia have words for scoria and volcano. The Ngario on the high plains, they've got words for snow. No other languages in Australia got words for snow. They don't need it. They've never seen it. They have stories about the snow, but they don't have a word for it because they find the snow really hard to imagine. But, you know, this is not just about people living on the land and having a nice time. This is about people living on the land and staying there and refusing to leave the land and refusing to take anyone else's land. The single greatest gift that Aboriginal people... I'm shaking my bloody finger now, eh? Send me home. It's time to go home. If I wag my finger, kick me out. I'll put them in my pocket. The single greatest thing that Aboriginal people are ready to bequeath to Australian people and the world is the fact that in this country alone, as far as I can work out with my enormous scholarship, this is the only place where there was never a land war. Think of Lebanon. Think of Israel. Think of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Think of South America. The Indians being kicked out of their forests now because someone wants to cut down all their trees. Land war, land war, land war. And in Australia, there was this people who decided that they would not go to war. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't because they didn't have the weapons to do it. It wasn't because they didn't have the strength. It wasn't because they didn't have the organisation. They decided not to do it. It's an incredible thing. No other place on earth has done this. And I get agitated because I sometimes think we're going to pass this by. We, you know, I'm talking as the Cornishman, you know, we Australians. We might pass this by and the world needs it. And it doesn't mean to say you have to go cap in hand to Aboriginal people and say, oh, you are such beautiful, wise people, because that'll turn their stomach and they'll be off their tucker for weeks afterwards if you say that. But investigate this thing. Ask Aboriginal people, how on earth was this done? Because the songlines, the great songlines of Australia that connected all the places together in spirit were also the trade routes. That's how the grass, this particular grass that Sir Thomas Mitchell saw and Leichhardt saw and Edward Gregory saw, this grass was traded all around the great centre of Australia. It shouldn't be in some of the places it is, but it was taken there by Aboriginal traders. These are important things. They went along the songlines, but also what went along the songlines was diplomacy. The old girls and the old men getting together and continually, generation after generation after generation, saying, we will not go to war against each other. I'll belt you on the bloody head if you bloody, you know, touch my figs, or if you knock off those eels, or if you, you know, take my sister's child, I'll kill you. And if you break the, you know, the law, I'll kill you. But I won't take your land. It's a mighty thing. It's mighty. And, you know, we're on the brink of something that the world needs. Uri Pryor on the TV the other night was saying, and I think it was a wonderful thing to have heard. I was thrilled to hear it. One of the interviewers was saying to him, oh, you people, you know, such wise and beautiful people. you know, why you've had such harm done to you, you know, why don't you go to war? Why don't you take up arms? I've heard this a number of times, you know, because people haven't got it yet. What Buri Pryor said was, because we are nice people. We are a peaceful people. Our culture honours peace. That's what we want. We don't want war. We'd much rather have the law than war. And I thought it was a wonderful thing to have said. Can I tell you a few yarns about some... I had a lovely day the other day driving through Victoria, and I went and saw old Uncle Peter, and we just sat down and had a cup of tea and a bit of a yarn, and he told me a story about old Munns, a man called Munns, who used to walk between Bega and Bairnsdale in New South Wales to Victoria to walk it. He would never take a lift. And he had 3 dingoes used to walk with him. He was a spirit man, and the dingoes were spirit dogs. And his job was to look after the spirit of all that country and all those people, because he was responsible for it. And all the other... he walked through the lands of maybe 15, 16 clans, and he was welcome wherever he went. Everyone accepted Munns to come to to their country and help look after country. He was a great man, and while old Uncle Peter was talking about it, his eyes shone. They shone with love for the old days and that old man. Now, I've just written a book. This is a sneaky way of saying I've written a book, bloke, which is coming out on August the 3rd. Make a great Christmas present. But I've dedicated it to Munn's 3-stick fire, because I now live down at Gypsy Point. I'm sort of back in that country again now. In the old days, in the 70s, I had a farm there on the Marramingo Creek. And I used to find these little fires there, tiny little fires, you know, and they intrigued me, because all the other people who used to come by with their combi vans and their camper vans and that, they'd make fires, and you could tell, you know, that it wasn't this particular person, because sometimes the baked bean tin would still be in the fire, the beer cans would still be in there, but even neat people made massive fires, you know, big lumps of wood, tree branches, you know, and... You know, I'd think, because it was pretty remote country there, you know, a lot of people had to camp because, you know, it gets dark, you've got to stop. So people camped on the edge of that land there. And I'd walk around and have a look, and I'd say, oh, that was a nice camp, you know, I hope they had a real good night, because they're right beside the water, you know, would have been lovely, eh? And then I'd come across one of these other little fires, and the hair would stand up on the back of my neck, because old Munns had been there, that old man, and it put the willies right up me, I can tell you. I never met the old fella, but I always knew when he'd been. And in this book I talk about old Munns with a great deal of love, even though I never saw his face, because I felt, in a way, he was looking after me, which was pretty generous to look after a fella like me, eh? Anyway, that's about it, eh? I was going to talk about Hetty Perkins, who's not here tonight, and Rachel, and good old Uncle Charlie, eh? Who said that a black man, or particularly a black child, boy or girl, should swim in the same swimming pool as a white boy or girl. What a wonderful thing to say. What a wonderful man. And how incredible that his 2 daughters are better than him.